In the vast expanse of the universe, few planets were as hostile as Varelia. Known for its harsh landscapes and towering mountain ranges, the planet had a reputation for producing some of the fiercest warriors in the galaxy. Varelia's alien species, the Varelians, were a proud ancient race, often misunderstood by other species due to their harshness and warlike nature. Earth had been in conflict with Varelia for decades, but there had always been an undercurrent of diplomacy, an unspoken understanding that one day peace could be possible. A human diplomat had been sent to Varelia on a peacekeeping mission. His task was simple: negotiate a treaty between Earth and the Varelian Empire, which had been torn apart by years of civil unrest. The galaxy was watching, hoping that these talks would bring a resolution. Yet, he was no stranger to difficult negotiations. This wasn't the first time he had represented Earth on foreign soil. But Varelia was different. The tension in the air was palpable, and every Varelian he met seemed to carry the weight of their planet's past conflicts. When arrived at the royal palace, the sight of the towering spires and the harsh landscape surrounding it was unlike anything he had seen before. The architecture was beautiful in its own right, but it was also a reminder of the kingdom's history. It was a palace built for strength, not for luxury. The queen's guards, clad in intimidating armor, stood at attention as he entered, but there was little warmth in their eyes. Understood that his presence here was not welcome, but it was necessary. Peace was necessary. The palace's interior was equally imposing. Cold stone walls echoed with the sound of footsteps, and tapestries of the royal family's long lineage lined the hallways. The throne room was massive, with a high ceiling and a raised dais where the queen sat, her stern gaze fixed on him as he entered. The queen, Empress Ilana, was everything he had heard about, and more. Tall, regal, and incredibly powerful in both presence and manner, she wore the weight of her people's expectations on her shoulders. Her eyes were sharp, and her expression unreadable. She did not smile as she welcomed him. She simply motioned for him to sit. The air was thick with tension, but knew how to play the game of diplomacy. He kept his posture straight and his voice calm as he spoke of peace and cooperation between Earth and Varelia. However, just as the talks began, a sudden interruption caused a shift in the room's atmosphere. One of the queen's advisors rushed in, panic evident in his steps. He whispered urgently in the queen's ear. The moment he finished, Empress Ilana's expression turned from stoic to something more serious. Concern, maybe even fear. Without saying a word, too, she stood and walked swiftly toward the advisor. Her voice, normally steady, was now tinged with worry as she demanded to know more. The advisor spoke in hushed tones, but even could hear the distress in his words. "The princess! Aelia, she's sick." The room fell silent at the mention of the queen's daughter. The air grew colder, and could feel the tension tighten. Princess Aelia was not just the queen's daughter. She was the heir to the throne of Varelia, and her health was vital to the stability of the entire planet. If something had happened to her, it would spell disaster for the royal family and the entire empire. Empress Ilana's face turned pale. She turned back to her expression cold and distant, and spoke with a firmness that left no room for argument. "Human, you will come with me. The princess needs immediate medical attention." Without waiting for his response, she turned and left the room, was quick to follow, his mind racing. What had happened to the princess? Was it something natural, or was it a result of the constant political unrest that Varelia had been facing? As he walked down the cold hallways of the palace, the sounds of his footsteps echoed against the stone walls. He could feel the weight of the situation settling on him. When they reached the princess's chambers, was struck by how different it looked compared to the rest of the palace. It was filled with beautiful tapestries and soft, warm lighting, a stark contrast to the cold and imposing royal halls. The princess's bed was in the center of the room, and several royal healers surrounded her, their voices hushed and filled with worry. Princess Ilia, normally proud and strong, lay still on the bed, her face pale, her eyes closed. She looked fragile, as if life itself was slipping away from her. Empress Ilana's eyes were filled with a kind of grief that Nera had never seen before. This was not the commanding queen he had met in the throne room. This was a mother in distress, desperate to save her child. Could see the raw emotion in her eyes, and though he knew that he wasn't welcome here, he also knew that this was no time for politics. One of the healers stepped forward, bowing to the queen. "We've tried everything, Your Majesty, but nothing seems to work. We fear that the princess may not survive." The queen's face hardened. "Then we must find a way. There has to be a solution." It was in that moment that DNA spoke up. He had no medical experience, but he had read about countless treatments on Earth, some of which involved alternative, unconventional methods. He stepped forward, speaking in the calmest voice he could muster. "I may not know the alien medicine, but I've studied many healing techniques from my world. There is a chance that I can help." The room went silent, and all eyes turned to him. Empress Ilana's gaze was sharp as a blade, and her voice cold as ice when she spoke. "You will not use my daughter as some experiment."
"I understand," said quickly, stepping back.
"But this is the only chance you have. If you don't let me try, there may be nothing left to save her." For a long moment the queen said nothing. Her eyes narrowed as she studied them. Then, with a sigh, she looked at the healers and gave a sharp command. "Let him try." It was a dangerous gamble, and Nain knew it, but he had to try. He didn't have a choice. The room cleared, and the princess was left alone with the princess. He gently placed his hands on her, his mind focused entirely on her health. His thoughts were a whirlwind, but he knew that he had to keep calm. He began applying the treatment, a combination of earth-based healing techniques and a few concepts he had come across in his research. For the first time since his arrival, felt truly out of his element. But he knew that he could not let the princess die. Time seemed to stretch on forever as he worked. The room felt heavy, the silence almost suffocating. But after what seemed like hours, the princess's breathing steadied, and her color began to return. The faintest flicker of hope began to spark in his chest. Empress Ilana returned shortly afterward, her eyes immediately searching the princess. She looked down at her daughter and then, for the first time, a small smile flickered across her face. "She's stable," the queen whispered, as though she could hardly believe it. "You did it." But there was no time for celebration. He was aware that this was only the beginning. Princess Ilia had been saved for now, but the real challenges lay ahead. The queen's gaze turned toward him, her eyes narrowing once more. "You may have saved her life," she said softly. "But you've only just begun to earn my trust, human." And though the future was uncertain, one thing was clear. Their story had only just begun. The days that followed the princess's miraculous recovery were filled with uncertainty and hope. The royal palace, once full of tension and mistrust, seemed to take on a new energy, though it was clear that not everyone was convinced that the human diplomat was the right solution. Despite the miraculous healing, whispers filled the corridors of the palace, and the Virillian healers were skeptical of Earth's methods. To them, the human techniques were a mystery, an unknown that could never be fully trusted. But one thing was certain: Princess Ilia was no longer at death's door. And for now, that was enough. In the days after the princess's recovery, Empress Ilana spent every moment by her daughter's side, watching her closely. The queen was fiercely protective of Ilia, her eyes never leaving her child for long. It was easy to see that the queen's once cold demeanor had softened. The stoic ruler was now a mother first. Her priorities shifted in a way that was unfamiliar to those who had known her for years. Despite the queen's softened demeanor, remained cautious. He was aware that his actions had been a gamble, and even though the princess was stable, he knew that the queen's trust would not come easily. He had saved her daughter, yes, but that did not erase the history of conflict between their people. Empress Ilana was not one to quickly forget the past, but as the days turned into a week, began to see the changes in Princess Ilia. She had been weak at first, unable to stand or even speak clearly, but now she was growing stronger with each passing day. Her eyes had regained their brightness, and the color had returned to her skin. The weakness that had once claimed her was fading, replaced by the strength of the princess, who had once ruled with an iron fist. The first time Ilia spoke to, it was not with the cold, indifferent tone that had characterized their previous encounters. Instead, there was a hint of warmth in her voice, a softness that surprised him. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice still weak but sincere. I don't know what you did, but it worked. You saved my life." Though there was a nervousness in his chest. He had never expected Alia to show gratitude, especially after all the bitterness that had flowed between them before. "I'm just glad you're better," he said softly. "You don't have to thank me. It was just a chance." Ilia shifted slightly in her bed, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that caught him off guard. "It wasn't just a chance," she replied, her voice stronger now. "You did something different. And I'm grateful for that." She was quiet for a moment before she added, almost as if she was speaking to herself.
"I thought I was going to die. I thought I would never see my mother again."
"I thought that everything I had fought for would be gone." Could see the pain in her eyes. And for the first time, he truly saw her, not as the cold, distant princess, but as a young woman who had lived through loss, fear, and uncertainty. There was a vulnerability there, a side of her that few had ever seen, and something in him shifted, a connection that had never been there before. She wasn't just a princess. She was a person, just like him, with hopes and fears and dreams of her own. "I'm glad you didn't have to go through that," he said quietly. "You deserve to live." Alia's lips curled into a small smile, but it was different from the defiant smiles she had once given him. This one was softer, filled with a gratitude she had never expressed before. For a while there was silence between them, but it was a comfortable one. There were no harsh words, no barriers between them, just two people, both with their own burdens, sharing a quiet moment in a world that seemed to be constantly at war. But that peace would not last. As the days passed, word spread across the palace that the princess was recovering faster than anyone could have imagined. The royal healers were baffled, but they could not deny the evidence before them. Princess Alia's strength was returning at an incredible pace, and it was clear that Ebb's intervention had played a crucial role in her recovery. It was a strange feeling for Catalina. On one hand, he was glad to see the princess doing better, but on the other, he couldn't ignore the reality of the situation. Empress Ilana had trusted him enough to allow him to heal her daughter, but the queen had made it clear that he still had much to prove. He had saved her daughter's life, but he had not yet earned the queen's trust, and the political tension between Earth and Varelia was still far from over. One evening, as Eiji was walking through the palace gardens, he was approached by the queen herself. Her presence was as commanding as ever, and her eyes were sharp as she regarded him. For a moment, there was silence between them, the tension palpable. Then, without preamble, the queen spoke. "Human," she said, her voice steady but cold. "I am not blind to what you have done for my daughter. You saved her life, and for that I owe you a debt." Nodded, not sure how to respond. He had expected something like this, but he still didn't know what to say. The queen's tone was respectful, but there was still a distance between them. She had not yet fully accepted him, not in the way he had hoped. But then, to his surprise, Empress Ilana took a step closer. Her expression softened. just slightly, and she spoke again, her voice lower this time. "I know that our people have been at war for years," she said. "And I know that you are not here to fight. But I also know that peace is not easily won. You have earned something from me. But what happens next will depend on what you do with it." Met her gaze, understanding that this was a pivotal moment. The queen had given him her respect, but respect was not the same as trust. If he wanted to secure peace between their worlds, he would need to prove that he was more than just a healer. He would need to show the queen that Earth could be trusted, that the people of Earth were worthy of a lasting alliance. "I won't let you down," he said simply. His voice was steady, filled with a sincerity that he hoped she could see. Empress Ilana regarded him for a moment longer before nodding. "We shall see," she said. "But know this, my daughter's life is no small matter. You have touched something in her, something I never thought would be possible, and for that, I am grateful. But you must tread carefully, for the road ahead will not be an easy one." With that, the queen turned and walked away, her presence as imposing as ever, but couldn't help but feel a small flicker of hope. This was the first time that the queen had spoken to him as something other than a tool, something other than an outsider. And though there was still much to prove, me know that he had taken the first step toward earning her trust. In the days that followed, continued to care for Princess Aelia, watching as her strength returned. But he also began to see the change in her, the way she began to open up to him. She was no longer the cold, distant princess he had first met. She was someone who had been through something life-changing, and it was clear that the experience had reshaped her. She was still fierce, still proud, but there was a vulnerability to her now, a softness that made her more human in his eyes. Aelia began to seek him out more often, asking questions about Earth, about the world he had come from. They spent hours talking, the walls between them slowly crumbling. Found himself drawn to her, not just as the princess, but as a person. There was a fire in her, a passion for life that he had always admired. She had been born into a world of war, a world where power was everything. But she was beginning to see beyond that, and as the days turned into weeks, he found himself starting to care for her in ways he hadn't expected. He had healed her once, but now, it seemed, she was healing him in return. Their bond, fragile as it was growing stronger with each passing day. The future was still uncertain, and the road ahead would be difficult. But for the first time since arriving on Varelia, could see the possibility of peace. A peace that would not come easily, but one that he was willing to fight for. The peace talks between Earth and Varelia had been going smoothly, at least on the surface. There were moments of genuine progress, shared understanding and tentative steps toward an alliance that could benefit both planets. But the deeper dove into the politics of Varelia, the more complicated everything seemed. Empress Ilana was determined to maintain her power, and though she seemed to trust so more than before, she was still hesitant to fully embrace the idea of peace with Earth. The warlike tendencies of her people ran deep, and some of her advisors saw the potential treaty as a weakness, a betrayal of everything Varelia had fought for over the centuries. Had been invited to many royal meetings, sitting in on discussions about the future of the empire, listening to the concerns of the generals, and even taking part in some of the strategies aimed at dealing with internal conflict. However, every time he thought he was making headway, a new complication arose. There was always someone, an advisor, a general, or even one of the royal family members, who voiced their doubts. The treaty with Earth was seen by many as a necessary evil, something to end the war but not something they truly wanted. Knew this, and it weighed heavily on his shoulders. But through all the political tension and opposition, there was one thing that had remained constant: his growing bond with Princess Aelia. They had been spending more time together, talking for hours about everything and nothing. She had become more than just the Queen's daughter in his eyes. She was someone he genuinely cared about, her strength, her resilience, her fierce determination to protect her people. It was impossible not to admire her. She had been through so much, and yet she never gave up. It was something that drew him to her, something that made him want to fight for a future where they could both live in peace, away from the shadows of their past. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the palace gardens, found himself walking with Alia. The two of them had just finished another long discussion about the treaty and the challenges they faced. There were moments when they were getting closer to an agreement, but the stubbornness of some of the Virelian factions made that goal feel impossible. "We're not going to win everyone over," said his voice low. Some of the generals are too deeply invested in the war to let it go. They believe peace is weakness. But Alia's eyes were filled with frustration. "I know. My mother feels it too. There are factions in the Empire that would rather burn it all to the ground than admit that peace is the way forward. It's not just the generals, it's everyone. The culture of war runs so deep in Virelia, we're not sure how to live without it." "Then we'll have to teach them," said his voice firm. "We can't just accept that war is the only way. We have to show them that peace doesn't make us weaker, it makes us stronger." Alia gave him a small smile. "You're not like anyone I've ever met before," chuckled, though it was tinged with sadness. "I'm just a diplomat." "All I've ever wanted is to help people come together, to bridge gaps. You've done that with me," Alia said quietly. "You saved my life. And now, you're saving my people." Her words made his heart beat faster, though he didn't know how to respond. He had come to care deeply for her, but there were so many obstacles between them, political, cultural, and emotional. Even if they were to find peace between their planets, how could they ever truly be together? She was a princess, a future queen. He was just a human diplomat, an outsider who had stumbled into their world by chance. A long silence followed, and for a moment they simply walked together, side by side, letting the weight of their thoughts settle in the cool evening air. The stars were beginning to appear in the sky, and the world seemed quiet, as if holding its breath. Then, without warning, a voice shattered the silence. A group of Virelian guards appeared from the shadows, their armored forms casting ominous reflections in the dim light. "Princess Alia, your Majesty demands your presence immediately," one of the guards said, his tone respectful but urgent. Alia stiffened, her face hardening. "Tell my mother I'm busy." The guard, though clearly hesitant, did not argue. "It is a matter of great importance, Princess." Reluctantly, Alia nodded. She turned to me, her eyes softening. "I have to go. There's no avoiding this." "I understand. I'll be here when you return." She gave him a brief smile, though there was something in her eyes, a flicker of doubt, maybe even fear, that made his chest tighten. "I'll be back soon." But David knew better than to think it would be that simple. Alia left quickly, her steps echoing in the quiet garden as she followed the guards, and for a brief moment was left standing alone, under the vast sky, filled with an uneasy sense of foreboding. Later that night was called to a meeting in the palace. The council room was filled with tension, and as he entered, the faces of the generals and the queen's advisors greeted him with expressions that were somewhere between impatience and anger. It was clear that something was amiss. "Human," one of the generals said, his voice sharp. "We have come to a decision." Raised an eyebrow, unsure of what this meeting was about. He had been making progress, but it seemed that something had gone terribly wrong. "What decision?" asked cautiously. "The princess has made a grave mistake," the general continued. "She has betrayed her people by siding with you. She believes in peace, but she is naive. Her ideals are a threat to Virelia, and as long as she continues to advocate for this treaty, she will be a threat to the Empire itself." A chill ran down Jan's spine as he processed the words. This was it, the moment he had feared. Alia's vision of peace was seen as a threat, and those who opposed her were going to take action. Are you suggesting that Aialia is a traitor? Asked. His voice steady despite the rising anger in his chest. The general's eyes narrowed. We have no choice but to remove her from power. She is a danger to the stability of Aurelia, and if she continues to side with Earth, she will be seen as an enemy of the Empire. The room fell silent, the weight of the general's words hanging in the air. The heart pounded in his chest. He had spent so much time trying to bring peace to this planet, trying to heal the wounds that had existed for so long, but now it seemed like everything was falling apart. The generals, the advisors, they had made up their minds. Aialia was no longer just the princess. She was a threat to the very empire she had been born to lead. Gaze hardened. You can't do this. The general shrugged. It's already been decided. You are not in a position to stop us. But Doctor wasn't about to let them tear apart everything he had worked for, everything Aialia had dreamed of. He had come to care for her deeply, and he wasn't going to let her be thrown aside just because her beliefs didn't align with the old guard. He knew that if they removed her from power, it would be the end of any hope for peace between their worlds.
I won't let you take her down, said firmly. You can't silence her.
Not like this. The room was filled with a tense silence, the weight of the moment heavy in the air. The future of both Aurelia and Earth seemed uncertain, but one thing was clear too. He would fight for Aialia, no matter what it took. And as he turned to leave the room, he knew that the path ahead would be far from easy. The rebellion within Aurelia had begun, and was caught in the middle of it, with only one goal in mind: to protect Aialia, to protect peace, and to ensure that the future of both planets would not be decided by war. The tension within the palace had reached a breaking point. Every corner of the royal grounds seemed to hum with nervous energy, as if the very walls of the ancient structure were bracing for the storm that was about to come. The Queen's Council had made their decision, and the generals had begun to make their move. Princess Aialia, despite her healing and her growing strength, was now the target of a dangerous political plot, one that threatened to tear Aurelia apart. Paced the royal gardens, his mind racing. The past few days had been a blur of meetings, heated discussions, and whispered threats. The generals and the royal advisors had made it clear that they would not tolerate Ailia's vision of peace. They viewed her as a threat to the Empire's legacy, and their solution was simple: remove her from power. And if that meant silencing her for good, so be it. But Baum refused to let that happen. He had seen the princess at her most vulnerable, and he had watched as she grew stronger with each passing day. Her desire for peace was not weakness. It was a strength that could bring an end to the endless war that had torn Aurelia apart for so long. Had to protect that strength, even if it meant defying the very people who held power in the Empire. As the sun dipped below the horizon, made his way to the royal chambers, Aialia had been summoned to meet with her mother, Empress Ilana, and knew this would be a crucial moment. The Queen was not one to be easily swayed, and the decision she made tonight could determine the fate of both Aurelia and Earth. When arrived at the chamber, he was met with resistance from the guards, but with a few quick words and a glance that conveyed more than his polite request, they allowed him inside. The tension was palpable. Aialia sat at the center of the room, her face a mask of determination. Empress Ilana stood across from her, her posture rigid, her expression unreadable. "You've come," Aialia said, her voice a mix of surprise and something softer. Relief, perhaps. There was a flicker of hope in her eyes, and she had been fighting for so long, fighting for peace, and now she was on the brink of losing everything. "I couldn't stay away," replied softly, stepping into the room. His eyes met Ailia's, and for a moment, the rest of the world seemed to fade away. There was only the two of them, their shared understanding of what was at stake. Empress Ilana's gaze shifted between them, her sharp eyes calculating, weighing every word, every gesture. "I have made my decision, Princess," she said, her voice cold. Your actions have threatened the stability of Varelia. You have chosen to side with the humans, and that is something I cannot allow." Ilia's jaw tightened, her hands clenched into fists. "I'm not siding with the humans, Mother," she said, her voice steady despite the anger that bubbled beneath the surface. "I'm choosing peace. I'm choosing a future where we no longer have to fight and die. You've seen the destruction, the suffering. We can't keep living like this. We need to change." Empress Ilana's expression remained unchanged. "The only way to preserve Varelia is through strength, Ilia. Through power. Your ideals are naive, and they will only lead to ruin. We are warriors. That is who we are. That is who we have always been." Took a step forward, his voice calm but firm. "With all due respect, Empress, peace is not weakness. It takes more strength to choose peace than it does to continue fighting." The Queen's eyes narrowed as she studied him, her lips curling into a thin smile. "You speak of peace, human, but you do not understand our ways. You do not know the cost of war. The blood that has been spilled for the survival of this empire didn't back down. And you don't know the cost of peace. You've fought for so long, but you've never stopped to consider what you're fighting for. At some point, the bloodshed must end. Or else, you'll have nothing left to fight for." A long silence hung between them, the weight of their words settling in the room like a storm about to break. Aelia stood up, her eyes filled with both determination and sorrow. "Mother," she said, her voice quiet but strong, "I won't back down. I believe in peace. I believe in a future where Varelia can live in harmony with Earth, where our people can rebuild instead of destroy. I know it's hard to accept, but it's the only way forward." Empress Ilana's gaze softened, just for a moment, but it was quickly replaced by a hardness that seemed to seal off any chance of compromise. "You are a princess, Ilia. You have a duty to your people, a duty to your family. Your duty is to Varelia, not to these humans. You will choose your path wisely." Alia's eyes flashed with defiance. "My duty is to do what is right, even if it means standing against you, even if it means going against everything I've been taught. I will not betray my beliefs for the sake of tradition. I will not let my people continue down this path of destruction." Watched in silence as the tension in the room reached its peak. It was clear that Aelia was ready to make her stand, and he couldn't help but admire her for it. She had already sacrificed so much for the people of Varelia, and now she was willing to sacrifice her own future to protect them. She was stronger than anyone gave her credit for. The Queen, though clearly angered by her daughter's defiance, seemed to hesitate. It was a brief hesitation, one that only lasted a moment, but it was there. For the first time, Empress Ilana's icy demeanor faltered. She looked at Aelia, and for a fleeting second it was as if she saw the young woman she had once known, the daughter she had raised, the princess she had loved. But that moment passed quickly, replaced by the cold resolve that had defined the Queen for so long. "Very well," she said, her voice tight with control. "If you refuse to listen to reason, if you refuse to put the good of Varelia above your own ideals, then you will have no place here. You will no longer be the heir to the throne." Ilia's face remained calm, but there was a flicker of pain in her eyes. The words stung, but she didn't let them show. "I won't fight for a throne that is built on war and hatred. If that means I have no place here, then so be it." The room was thick with tension as the Queen's words hung in the air. For a long moment, neither nor Ilia spoke. There was a quiet understanding between them, a shared recognition of the sacrifices that were being made. Aelia had chosen her path and had chosen to stand beside her. "You've made your choice," Empress Ilana said, her voice cold as ice. Then you will leave. You will be exiled from Varelia, and you will not return until you've learned the consequences of your actions. Aelia stood tall, her gaze unwavering. Then I'll leave, but I'll return, Mother. I will return, and I will fight for a future where Varelia can stand beside Earth. Not against it. The Queen said nothing more, her lips pressed into a thin line. She turned away, her back to them, as if dismissing them entirely. The guard stepped forward, ready to escort Aelia from the room. As Aelia walked past, she paused for a moment, her eyes meeting his. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion, "for believing in me." Mean smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "I believe in you more than you know." And with that the princess turned, leaving the room, leaving behind a kingdom that had once been her home, and stepping into the unknown. Watched her go, his heart heavy with the knowledge that this was only the beginning of a much greater battle. A battle not just for peace, but for the future of two worlds. But as he stood there, watching Aelia walk away, he knew one thing for certain. He would stand by her, no matter the cost. They would fight together, and together they would change the future.